that. Howdy everyone, good afternoon. I am Lei, the CVA. I am the Community Volunteer Ambassador of the Santa Monica Mountains Natural Recreation Area. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and read our general consent statement. Gotta minimize it. As a visible disclosure, we'd like to inform any participants that any and all Zoom series is and will be recorded. The purpose of this is to provide the Zoom series to those who participated or missed out on the session. It is also provided the information for participants to refer back to. In addition to the visible disclosure, this statement will be orally stated at the beginning of each Zoom series like I am right now. And I'm going to stop sharing and hand it off to Riza to introduce our speaker today.
All right, thank everybody, and thanks, Lei. Today we have a special speaker from Joshua Tree. Sasha wears many hats. She does interpretation, and she also runs the volunteer program there at their park. I met Sasha at one of our trainings for leaderships, and she's doing great big things at Joshua Tree, and so we invited her here to give us a little insight on what they do at their volunteer program. So before we begin, just remind yourself to have yourself on mute. If you have any questions, you can use the chat bar, or if it's a real question you don't want to forget, Sasha has been open to allow questions during the presentation. Just remind yourself to mute yourself again so she has full volume control, okay? So Sasha, it's up to you, and you could share your screen now.
Cool. Okay, thank you for the introduction, Riza, and thank you, Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, for having me. And thank you all for volunteering. I'm really excited. I attended one of these sessions after Riza had first invited me to present about our volunteer program, and it was the coyote presentation. It was really cool. I'm originally from Los Angeles, and I never knew that Santa Monica Mountains were there, let alone had an NPS site there. So thank you for all the work that y'all are doing, you know, in the NPS. You are really special, and we have some special volunteers too, and I will tell you a little bit more about our program. So let's see if I can share my screen. Okay, and then let me minimize this a little bit. So, okay, cool. Okay, so my name is Sasha Travaglio. I work in interpretation, and I manage the Parks Volunteer Program. And someday it will turn to the next slide. Okay, hold on. Let's see. It was being a little funky when we did this. So let me see if I can do it this way, because I don't want it to lag so much. There we go. This is better. Here we go. Okay, so a little bit about Joshua Tree National Park. How many of you, raise your hand, although I can't see all of you, raise your hand if you've been to Joshua Tree before. Okay, cool. Looks like we've got some people. That's great. So it was founded in 1936 as a national monument. And the reason that we became a park is because mostly of the actions of a woman named Minerva Hamilton Hoyt. She was originally from Pasadena and discovered the desert nearby that is now known as Joshua Tree National Park, and just really fell in love with the area. It brought her a lot of peace during turmoil in her life, like the death of her husband and her child. And so she was really reliant on this area and really valued the natural beauty that she found here. And she became concerned for the preservation of the area, and she lobbied Congress for many years to protect the area from about Highway 10 up to Highway 62 here in the Morongo Basin, to protect the area as a national park site. And eventually it became a national park, or a national monument in 1936, all thanks to Minerva. So she's pretty cool. And then we achieved national park status in 1994. And the big difference between a national monument and a national park is really funding. So as a national park, you just get a little bit more funding than a national monument. The park size continues to grow, which is really cool. We have a local land trust, the Mojave Desert Land Trust, who some of y'all may have heard of. And they acquire large pieces of natural land, and mostly large pieces of natural land, and donate them to public lands agencies. So we've gotten some new property that has just expanded our border little by little, but our park is continuing to grow and hopefully will continue to grow. Some of the reasons that people come to visit Joshua Tree are our Monzo granite boulders. Joshua trees, of course, cholla. We have a cholla cactus garden in our Pinto Basin, which has about 175,000 cholla cactuses. It's really impressive. And if you haven't been there, I definitely suggest going there when you visit the park. We're also popular for our bighorn sheep. I believe we have about 3 or 4 pretty large herds, which they're not seen very often, but they do enjoy the habitat here. And then we're popular for dark night skies. Stargazing is really great here, especially in the summer when you can see the Milky Way. And we have a pretty rich music history that I'm not super familiar with, but a lot of people come to kind of have the same experiences that musical artists in the 1900s had. And then of course we are popular for our desert tortoises that we protect, which are on the endangered species list. So Joshua Tree is cool because we actually protect 2 deserts, the Colorado Desert, which is a subsection of the Sonoran Desert. So it's a little bit hotter, the precipitation patterns are a little bit different, and it's lower elevation. And then the Mojave Desert, which is the upper part of the park, I would say the northern part of the park, is a little higher elevation, the precipitation patterns are different, it gets a little bit more snow than the Colorado Desert on average, and it is the only place that Joshua trees live. So Joshua trees are only in the Mojave Desert part of the park, while the Colorado Desert has more expansive desert with mountains in the background, like Pinto Mountain you can see in that photo, lots of creosote, cactuses. It's really quite different if you drive all the way through the park, the northern part of the park where the Mojave is versus the southern part of the park where you're in the Colorado. It's pretty neat. And then here are some examples of why people come to the park. So dark night skies, beautiful picture of the Milky Way, climbing, and of course, Joshua trees and beautiful sunsets. So we have not only grown in size physically, but we have also grown in visitation. So when we started as a national, this is the most recent graph that I have. I think that we are still around 3 million visitors on average annually. I don't know how the pandemic has affected that this year. That'll be interesting to see because the park was closed for about, I would say, 3 to 4 weeks during the pandemic when we had the shelter in place order from Governor Newsom. But yeah, so you can see that suddenly in about, 2013, so 7 years ago, we just exploded in popularity. We are really close to Los Angeles, we're close to San Diego, we are close to Vegas, and we are kind of on the way, when folks are traveling east-west on road trips. We are also a destination in and of itself. So we have a lot of folks coming here to visit. And while we love our visitors and, public lands are here for everybody to enjoy, it's hard to manage the explosion in visitation with the same budget that we have had. So that is a challenge that our park faces, is managing this increased visitation when we don't have an increased budget. So that is a big way that volunteers come in. So why does volunteerism exist? If anyone wants to write in the chat some reasons that you volunteer or why you think volunteerism exists, give us some insight. And I don't actually have access to the chat because I'm sharing my screen. So Riza or Lay, if you want to read some of those things, I would love to hear them. Hopefully people are chatting.
Let's see. Someone said it for experience.
Cool.
Carrie says you can solve all our problems.
It's true.
You can help.
Volunteers solve all of our problems.
Nancy said it feels great, good to do. Sandy, giving back to the community. Let's see, educate others on why we preserve the park and its resources.
Nice, that's important. Cool. Okay. Well, it sounds like y'all know why you volunteer. Volunteerism exists for a variety of reasons. There are lots of different reasons that like a organization will recruit for volunteers, and there are lots of different reasons that individuals volunteer. I volunteered myself, and I know I share some of those same reasons. You know, I want to give back to my community. I want to participate in things that are important, and it makes me feel good to volunteer. So I go back to this if it lets me. Great. So volunteers support work that would otherwise go unfinished. We literally, you know, could not function without volunteers. It helps the volunteers. So if you're trying to make a career change, or, you know, you're a high schooler or a college, you know, aged person, and you want to get professional skills and experience, and then eventually get paid for those things, volunteerism is a great way to start that. It helps you form a connection with an organization or a place itself. So we often feel a really special connection to the places that we volunteer and the people that we volunteer with, which is really important. And then it makes you feel good. Volunteering makes you feel good. And that's one of the big reasons that we all volunteer, is because we like it. So two main types of volunteers, two main categories of volunteers we have, as you probably know, are individual volunteers and group volunteers. And I'll go into it a little bit when I talk about our program, but you know, there are folks who come on an individual basis, whether it's for like an internship over the course of, you know, 1 to 3 months, or someone who is coming to, who lives locally and is going to volunteer on a long-term basis. And then we have groups that come to volunteer at the park. So they could be through an alternative spring break group, and they're gonna, you know, volunteer on a project for a week, or it could be through a public volunteer opportunity. And at Joshua Tree, we don't do a lot of those. I'm hoping that we can change that in the next couple of years and have more public volunteer opportunities. You know, like some of the ones that I can think of that are pretty common are like trash pickups and plantings and stuff like that, where just anyone can drop on by and volunteer. But those are the two main types of volunteers that we have. Okay, so looking at JOTR, stands for Joshua Tree National Park. For those of you who don't know the short-term acronym, Santa Monica Mountains is SAMO. But so we have the person who oversees the park is our superintendent, David Smith. And then we have chiefs in all of our 5 divisions. So we have science and resource stewardship, interpretation, which I work in, protection, administration, and maintenance. And then under those 5 chiefs of those divisions, we have other folks like branch managers, program managers, and that's kind of where all of the main staff are in these like lower level divisions. So all of the bolded words, or all the bolded, I would say, sections are where we have had folks volunteer before. I mean, volunteers do a lot of things. There can be volunteers who maybe don't have any like special skills and really want to help with like labor or filing. And then we do have volunteers who are very skilled and like have special training or experience that will really help them accomplish a more specialized task. So volunteers of all types are really valuable. So let's start by talking about our science and resource stewardship division. And so we have our cultural resources branch. And some of the ways that volunteers help in our cultural branch is with historic structure restoration. We have some archaeology technicians, library and collections assistants, and Keys Ranch caretakers. So you can see up at the photo on the top right, that's our Keys Ranch property, which is a historic property in the park that the park inherited, I believe, in 1969 upon the death of Bill Keys, who was a rancher and miner here in the area. He donated the property, he and his family donated the property to the park. And so now we do tours there and try to preserve the area. So you can see, it's a little small, but you can see that little volunteer hat in there. And that is our Keys Ranch caretaker helping with a restoration project. And our caretakers, they essentially, they have a really sweet job. So they, during our busy season, which is October through May, will stay at Keys Ranch and basically just like keep watch on the place, because we have so many historic and cultural artifacts from when Native American tribes lived here through when the Keys family lived here, that we want to protect those things and want to make sure that they don't get stolen or damaged. And we also do sometimes get folks who are like backpacking or hiking and just kind of like wander out there, even though it's an area that's closed unless you are on a guided tour. So the caretakers just get to live in this really beautiful remote spot and kind of keep watch on the place. And then when we do interpretive tours, usually they'll join us on our tours. And when we do restoration out there, they'll usually help with the restoration, but they do have a pretty sweet gig. But you don't have cell service and you're, you know, like 25 minutes, 30 minutes from town. So there are challenges as well. So yeah, we do historic restoration. We don't usually have archaeology technicians because those are pretty, I would say, they're selective. Our cultural resources crew is like a little bit selective. They want folks who are like studying cultural resources or have experience in cultural resources, because I actually went to cross-train and help with an archaeology project last week. And I was like digging a plot and like processing all of the dirt that I collected and trying to find, you know, if there's anything that was worth taking out of that plot there. And I was not very good at it. I've never done anything like that. And so I think that they're probably, and they actually have a volunteer with them right now who studied like cultural resources, and he's great. He's like a member of the team and knows how to do everything and was helping me. So yeah, they are a little more selective with their volunteers because of the high skill level that's required for what they do, which I did not have. And then we sometimes have folks volunteer in our library, which is our, what we also call the collection. So we have like some historic, cultural, and natural resources in this one building at the park, and they'll help like catalog things and file them and just kind of organize that area so that we can stay organized, which is really important. But yeah, so our cultural resources branch has a few volunteer opportunities. And then our vegetation branch is where honestly most of our volunteer opportunities happen. Our veg branch loves volunteers. So if I move this over. So one of our most popular volunteer projects that volunteers love, that I love, that is really valuable to the park is our community science plant specialist position. So those are the folks on the bottom of the screen that are measuring Joshua trees and collecting data. So we have many plots throughout the park where we are collecting regular data to kind of like monitor how Joshua trees and the associated plant community are doing. And these volunteers go out there and they set up these plots and then they measure all these things and they take all this data. It'll be really valuable for us to understand what is happening with Joshua trees and what is happening with the desert plant community. And, you know, we have a group of, I would say, about like 10 volunteers that have been really consistent on that project. And we are able to use those volunteers to help support groups volunteering in this capacity as well. So when we have like alternative spring break groups or, you know, a Boy Scout group or a Girl Scout group that want to do something in the park, often we will put them with this community science plant specialist program because it's great for groups, because the more people, the faster the work gets done, because you have like a few people measuring and a few people, you know, like writing and taking data on the tablet. So that is a really fun program that we have. We also have folks who act as phenology monitors, and that is a position where folks basically have a group or like an area where they're monitoring certain plants for their activities. So they will look at when they're blooming, when the blooms die off, how many blooms they have. So it's really busy in the springtime, but throughout the rest of the year, it's not too busy. So those folks we like to have for at least a year or more on our team so that they can really monitor those plants and see what's going on with them. And then we have our invasive plant patrol, which is another really fun program. So you can see at the top photo, this young lady is collecting some what looks like mustard from here. We have a lot of invasive grasses and mustard in the park. And as y'all probably know, invasives are not good for the natural ecosystem, so they outcompete native plants so that they have less access to resources. So invasives are often able to grow faster and bigger with smaller resources, and then their roots are so big and the plants themselves are so big that then they just kind of deplete those resources from the area so that native plants can't use them. And then they also contribute to our fire regime. So naturally in the Mojave and Colorado deserts, or yeah, I would say in where Joshua Tree National Park is, fire is not a really natural part of our ecosystem because usually the plants are really spread out. There's not a lot of fuel between big plants like Joshua trees and Mojave yucca and creosote. So if a fire starts from a lightning strike or something like that, the fire usually is able to die out, without spreading very much. But with these invasive grasses, they fill every bit of bare space on the desert floor. So now if there's, a Joshua tree that gets caught on fire from a lightning strike, it just spreads if we don't catch it because of these dried invasive grasses. So the invasive plant patrol is really cool because they go out in the springtime, kind of after, it has to be timed well with when the mustards and grasses are growing. And they go out and they collect big bunches of these like satellite populations, which are more like controllable. And then they also go out on their own and try to monitor for satellite populations so that we can get ahead of invasive infestations before they start. So the IPP, the Invasive Plant Patrol, is more focused on these satellite populations because they are, when we already have an infestation in an area, our work is unfortunately just like not that, it doesn't have that great of a success rate because these invasives are just so powerful. So if we're able to control the smaller populations, then they don't become a problem. So IPP is excellent. Okay, and then we also have other opportunities in vegetation like planting. So we do restoration, like vegetation restoration for a few different reasons. We have some many miles of dirt roads in the park that folks are welcome to, take their off-road vehicles on, but there is no off-roading in the park. And that's because the desert is a really sensitive environment. I've heard anecdotally as many times as, like 3 to 5 times of a small plant under the ground being stepped on, it won't grow anymore. So anyways, the desert responds really quickly to disturbance. So that's why we don't allow any off-roading in the park. But some folks don't know that. And so they will, go off-road off of a dirt road, or they'll enter the park from, kind of like an illegal spot that doesn't actually have a road access. So we do some OHV restoration to try to clear up these areas that have been kind of like plowed down by OHV vehicles so that they don't look like roads, so that other people don't follow that lead, because some folks will drive on something that they think is a road. So if we make sure that those are restored to more of the way they look naturally, it is helpful to deter other folks from doing that. And then we also have a lot of social trails. So in an environment, like in the Pacific Northwest, where there's like an abundance of, big bushy plants like ferns everywhere and big Douglas firs, it's pretty hard to go off trail because you see the trail and that's where you go, and you don't really want to go off trail because you can't walk very well because you're walking through a bunch of plants that might be like kind of spiky and itchy, or I'm thinking specifically of like sword ferns. Those are like a little sharp. Anyways, a lot of folks will like go off trail in our park and like explore just parts of the desert that don't have trails. And again, desert plants are really reactive to disturbance. So with folks walking over and over in the same area, plants stop growing there. And it just starts looking a lot different because there's less vegetation. And also more folks start thinking that's a trail. So we do a lot of planting on our social trails too. And that is a really fun project. As you can see, the folks up in the top corner, doing, they're putting a cage around a young plant, which I can't actually see the plant, but the cages are important because otherwise the critters might nibble on them, and we want to give the plants a chance to get big and to grow before they get eaten. And then we have a nursery where we grow plants for our revegetation projects. And our nursery manager, Jean, will sometimes have volunteers in there who help kind of like water the plants and repot them and stuff like that. So that is another place we have volunteers help. And then we have our climber stewards who fall in the vegetation branch because our climbing ranger, Bernadette, is employed in that branch, because the purpose of our climbing ranger is essentially to make sure that folks know how to, folks who are coming to climb in the park understand the rules and regulations here that might be different from other places that they've climbed or a gym where they've climbed before. So something that's unique to Joshua Tree is that you can't like make an anchor on any vegetation, which is really, really common in places like Yosemite where they have big, strong trees that can like hold a rope and a person attached to a rope. But here at Joshua Tree, you have to make those anchors in rocks, because it's illegal to tie something around a Joshua Tree, but if you did, it would probably just pop right off because they have really thin and like kind of shallow root systems. So the climber stewards, they live in our Hidden Valley campground, which was one of our popular campgrounds for climbing. So it's surrounded by rock formations. And they help with our climber coffee, which is a climber outreach program that we do every Saturday and Sunday, which will probably change the season because of COVID, but we usually do climber coffee Saturdays and Sundays, October through April or May. And so they help with climber coffee, and then they go on climbing patrols where they just kind of go and talk to like climbers who are in the area and make sure that they're not putting their crash pads on any vegetation, that they're, you know, not leaving chalk everywhere, and that they're being good stewards of the environment while we're here. Okay, so before I move on, did anyone have any questions about our vegetation volunteer opportunities? Or vegetation?
So one was, let's see, I had one actually, because Samo would like to start like a climbing steward. So with
nice.
this group, do you have certain like SOPs, or do you have them run GARs?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so we are, and I can put you in touch with our climbing ranger Bernadette too. But yeah, so our climbing stewards are, climber stewards, sorry, are like well vetted by our climbing ranger. So they have to have certain experience in Joshua Tree. They have to know how to do, you know, I'm not experienced enough a climber to know exactly what they have to do, but they have to, you know self-rescue techniques. They have to know how to set up a safe anchor here. And then it's often someone that, you know, has been here before and is familiar with our climbing ranger. So she can be like, oh yeah, I remember climbing with them once and they did seem really safe. And she'll also, once she hires someone, she'll, after like seeing their climbing resume, she'll go out with them to make sure that all the things they said are true, and that she can feel safe hiring them as a representative of the park. Yeah, so they have really strong JHAs, the job hazard analysis about, you know, what are the risks inherent with climbing for your volunteer duties, because climbing is dangerous, inherently dangerous, but if you're hiring the right people who have the right skills and can be safe, you know, it's mitigating some of the risk. But yeah, the JHA is really thorough.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
What other questions do we have? Anything?
I think that was it.
Cool. Okay, and we can always go back. Yeah. Okay, so I'll move on to wildlife. So wildlife is pretty selective with volunteers too, because it's a much smaller program than vegetation. So, which actually cultural resources is also a smaller program, which is maybe why we have less volunteers in cultural. But so our wildlife volunteers, one of the biggest things that we have volunteers do is they do tortoise telemetry. So you can see up at the top, one of our wildlife biologists, Kristen, is taking measurements on a tortoise, and you can see that that like little, I don't know what do you think that looks like? it's like a thing on its shell, but that's actually a transmitter that Kristen has like cemented there so that she can continue monitoring that tortoise and our volunteers can continue monitoring that tortoise. So the volunteer at the bottom is using telemetry to locate the tortoises so that she can do similar measurements to what Kristen is doing now. So just to make sure that the tortoises are healthy, kind of checking out where they're going, what their home range is, you know, if they find them in a new burrow that they haven't used before, or if they're on the other side of a road than they usually are, or if they're hanging out with another tortoise that they know, and making sure that they're healthy. So like checking their nostrils and their eyes for any like dry spots or crust, making sure that the pads on the top of their head are nice and fluffy, meaning that they're getting enough food, and checking their scutes, the individual like parts of their shell, to make sure that they are healthy looking and not flaking off or cracking. So tortoise work is a really important thing that our volunteers do because tortoises are really important in our ecosystem and they are on the endangered species list. So we want to make sure we are learning as much about them as possible so that we can continue to protect them. We also have butterfly counts and bird counts that we conduct usually seasonally or twice a year. So we'll do a butterfly count, I know, in the fall and the spring, and then bird counts we'll usually do like a Christmas bird count, and sometimes we'll do one in the spring too. And in bird counts, I would also say we do raptor monitoring to see where raptors are nesting. And often they're nesting in rocks that folks climb on. So if we have to, we will also close climbs to for some amount of time to make sure that those raptors are not disturbed. And then another cool thing that volunteers help with is we do a lot of like wildlife cams. So in more remote areas, just to check on, I would say a lot of our wildlife cams monitor like cougars, bighorns, foxes, bobcats, like kind of the larger animals that we have that are a little more evasive. So volunteers can sometimes help place those remote equipment pieces and also retrieve cards and exchange batteries and stuff like that. So volunteers help a lot with that too. Any questions about wildlife or our Science and Resource Stewardship Division? That's like the big healthy part of our volunteer program. We have a lot of SRS volunteers and they are all really important because that's a big part of why the NPS exists, is to protect those natural resources. Okay, let's move on to interpretation. So interpretations branches include interpretive operations, education, communications, and our partner association. So in operations, that's basically our visitor center and like visitor engagement. So we have our visitor service representatives who work in the VC, like Dave up there. And then we have trail rovers who interact with folks on the trails, like it sounds like y'all do too, and kind of like provide that in-park experience and education to folks. And then we also have our peak operations assistant volunteers, and those folks usually work from about, I would say, we try to recruit them for about like January through April, because that's a really busy season. It's probably similar at Samo, and actually probably a lot of Western parks, but March and April during spring breaks, we get slammed with visitors, and our parking lots are all full, our lines are really long, people are parking off the road and parking on plants. So our peak operations assistants help by staffing parking lots, staffing our entrance booths, and helping manage crowds. So providing visitors like friendly education contacts to make sure that they're following the rules and they're being safe. And also providing them information on like alternatives. So, if one parking lot is full, they can provide an alternative opportunity for them so that folks are still having a good visit, even if the parking lot is full. So, and I actually, before I started managing the whole volunteer program, I used to work with I used to supervise our interpretive operations volunteers, and they are awesome. We have had a lot of luck with getting volunteers who just like really love the park and love getting out there and know so many things. And they've been with us for many years. So those folks in the visitor centers are great. Okay, and then we have just our general interpretation volunteers who don't serve in the visitor center capacity or in visitor service capacity. So we sometimes have education assistants. So our education branch is the branch of the park that works with school groups. So they will lead field trips in the park, and they will also go into classrooms and kind of share information about the park and do activities with students, usually before or after that group has visited the park for a field trip. So we do have education assistants who will lead digital or virtual field trips, which actually are, you're gonna have the opportunity to talk to Simone, who works in our education branch, and she will give you a virtual field trip, which is why I didn't want to talk about the park too much, because I didn't want to steal our thunder. But yeah, so we have some volunteers who work with Simone in education, and they'll help on the field trips, and they'll do the virtual field trips like Courtney up there is doing, showing some kids some creosote and other desert plants. And then we have our Artist in Residence program, which has been around for many years, and it's changed a little bit in the way that it functions. But the Artist in Residence program is like a service-wide thing. Not every park site has an Artist in Residence, but it's not unique to Joshua Tree. So the Artist in Residence program, for those of you who haven't heard of it, it allows artists of like many, what's what I'm looking for, disciplines to volunteer at a park and kind of contribute their art in exchange for like housing. So we will house an artist in residence, and they will work on a project that helps support the park. So right now our artists in residence are usually working with our education branch. So you can see on the bottom, there's some young ladies who are painting the landscape in front of them, and that was with one of our artists in residence who was actually there leading the project. So with our program, we try to engage local youth in the park, which is a pretty cool thing because, you know, like I explained, I grew up next to Santa Monica Mountains, and I never went there because I didn't know it existed. But, you know, with programs like this, hopefully we're engaging with our local youth so that they know the park is here and they know that it belongs to them and that they belong in the park and can come and visit us. And then occasionally we'll have opportunities in our communications branch. We'll have a lot of folks contact us asking about, you know, wanting to take photos for the park, because there are a lot of photographers that come to Joshua Tree and, you know, they want to take photos and they want to contribute photos. So folks have the opportunity to donate their photos to the park, but they give up all rights to their photos. So sometimes people don't want to do that. And they maybe thought that it was going to be a different experience, but occasionally we'll have folks who come who are local and, you know, live here, and will occasionally take photos for the park, and we'll donate those photos, which is pretty cool. Okay, any questions so far about interp or wildlife?
Let's see. Are there any recent problematic shifts in flora and visitor demographics?
What was the second part? And
visitor demographics.
Visitor demographics.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about shifts in visitor demographics. I can say anecdotally, this year with the pandemic, so usually what happens is over the summer, we're a little slower because it's really hot here. And we have a lot of European visitors and international visitors who will come here, and they have RVs, and, you know, they're set up to be comfortable in the heat. With the pandemic and folks traveling less and having travel limitations, we did not get a lot of international visitors. But what we did get was a lot of folks who, you know, wanted to stay close-ish to home and came over to Joshua Tree. So we were like really packed on the weekends, and we had a normal summer visitation. But so I guess actually, yes, the demographics were different. You know, we didn't have those international visitors, but we still had the same summer visitation. So I think that folks are engaging in different outdoor spaces than they normally do because of the pandemic. And then shifts in vegetation, not that I know of. I know with the Joshua Tree was recently protected for, I think, a year under California Fish and Wildlife. I haven't fully read about the protection, but Joshua trees have gained additional protection under the Endangered Species Act, I think it was state enacted. And it's kind of, it seems like it's a little bit of a test so that we can do more research on Joshua trees and learn more about how climate change is affecting them, because that was why they were protected, because of the threat of climate change. And so that was a pretty big deal, because they were the first plant to be protected kind of preemptively because of the effect of climate change. So what we're seeing with Joshua trees is, and this isn't a new shift, but you know, it's been happening for several years, is that they're moving to higher elevations where it's cooler. So in the park, our Keys View location is the highest point you can drive to in the park. It overlooks the Coachella Valley and Palm Springs and Mount San Jacinto. It's a really beautiful spot. And one of my favorite drives in the park is actually the drive up to Keys View, because the Joshua trees there are super healthy. They look really happy. They're big and fat and fluffy, and there's a lot of them, like densely packed. It's really nice to see. So at the lower elevations, they're, you know, kind of not doing so well, but at the higher elevations, they're doing okay. And we're seeing things like that in Death Valley. One of the, because there are Joshua trees in Death Valley, and I think it's the Panamint Valley, but there's an area in Death Valley that is just like the Joshua trees are super happy and healthy. And another thing that I know about vegetation with climate change is that creosote is like the cockroach of the desert plant community. They are just like thriving. They're doing great. They love climate change. They can deal with the cold. They can deal with the heat. They don't care. Creosote is doing fine. So sounds like we don't have to worry about creosote, which is good. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let's move on to protection. So we've got law enforcement, fees, and emergency management. And as many of you may know, and I'm sure Riza and Lay know, volunteers are not allowed to volunteer in law enforcement. So unfortunately, you can't write any tickets, you can't carry a gun, you can't drive in the big car, but there are other things that you can help to protect the park and the visitors. So in our fees division, or sorry, our fees branch, we have our campground hosts, which are so important because we are a really popular camping spot, and most of us don't live in the park. And so our campground hosts live in the park, in the campground, and they help folks when they need it. And they walk around and they pull the tags from the people who, you know, have left, and then they put the tags on for the people who are coming the next day. So, and they help resolve campsite disputes, you know, when someone is in a site that was supposed to be someone else's. So they do a lot of really valuable work. And they're awesome. And we're really lucky. We've gotten some incredible campground hosts who've returned this year from last year, and it just makes things so nice when like our volunteers become like a long-term part of the team. It makes me really happy. I love forming relationships, so it's just really nice to be able to do that and not have to like always recruit, which I love meeting new people too, but it's just nice to have those relationships and like that trust and knowing that those volunteers are happy with the program. So our campground hosts are really important. We also have entrance ambassadors, which I think this program is going to ramp down a little bit because our fee staff just hired a bunch of people. So they probably don't need to supplement with volunteers as often. But our entrance ambassadors, if you can see at the top of the screen, this is a little deceptive because you see a gap in the cars. But at our west entrance, which is our most popular entrance, it's not our main entrance, but it's the first one that folks come to when they're coming through the town of Joshua Tree. It has a really long line during our busy season and on weekends. And you can't see in this picture, but like just beyond those Joshua trees and those rocks are people's homes. So our west entrance is like in a community, and when we have a long line, people are unable to get to their houses. So it is a negative impact on our local community. So our entrance ambassadors help move the line along. They check people's passes. Usually they're not authorized to handle funds, so they can't actually like take money and stuff, but they work outside like this gentleman is, and they look at the passes and then they say, go on in, everybody. So those are really important too. And then a huge part of our volunteer program is our JOTR program, our Joshua Tree Search and Rescue. We have about 45 regular volunteers in our JOTR program, and they help visitors who are in trouble So we have a few different teams on JOTR. We have our search team, and those are the folks who look for people who are lost. And then we have, or they also participate in carryouts, like if someone is having heat-related illness and they can't get off a trail themselves, the search folks will go and they'll, you know, help them by either giving them water and resting with them, or sometimes when they have to, they'll carry them out on a litter. And then we have our technical rescue folks who help people who have had climbing accidents or stuck climbing, and often people who are just like got up on a boulder and now they can't get down. So our technical rescue team helps people get to the ground safely. Our support team helps with like planning and mapping and all that sort of stuff. And then our preventative search and rescue, they do like they're at the trailheads and hiking the trails and making sure people know how much water they need, they know where they're going. They try to prevent having actual full-blown SARS. So yeah, our JOTR program is amazing, and those volunteers are like very dedicated, and we have call outs where I participate in JOTR too as a staff member, and you know, you can get a call out at 7 o'clock in the morning, 8 o'clock at night. Sometimes you'll have to go like at 5 in the morning, and those folks are showing up there wanting to help our visitors be safe and alive. So they're really important. Okay, and then last but not least, we have our maintenance division. So most of our volunteers in the maintenance division are on our trail crew. So we have our trail technicians who are the folks who are going out and like using loppers, like, you know, kind of big scissors essentially, and like small hand saws to clear the trails to make sure that they're well delineated and that the vegetation isn't growing into the trail. And also delineating trails. So you can see the folks on the bottom, they're kind of lopping off the branches of that plant, which I don't know what it is. And they also delineate with rocks. So making sure that the trail is easy to find, because it can be easy to get lost here in the desert. And then we have our graffiti defeater position. So we have volunteers who help remove graffiti on the rocks and on historic structures. And they use a variety of techniques. Sometimes they include pretty harsh chemicals, which is why this person is wearing a Tyvek suit. And another way that we've started removing graffiti from our historic structures just involves like tiny little motions to like remove etched stuff and make it look normal. But yeah, we've had a bit of an uptick in graffiti recently, which is a huge bummer. And so our graffiti volunteers are becoming even more important than they were before. And then Trails uses a lot of conservation corps. So we have the YCC in the summer, and then we'll have different conservation corps, like Native American conservation corps will come in and help with a lot of the same stuff. So doing trail delineation, brushing, sign placement, just making sure that the folks who are visiting the park know how to follow a trail and have access to lots of trails. Okay, and then our campgrounds crew, they are the ones who are taking care of like the campgrounds and the trash cans and the recycling bins and the toilets and making sure everything is clean. That's essentially what campgrounds does, is make sure everything is neat and tidy in the park. So we have folks who volunteer in campgrounds to do litter removal and fire pit maintenance, which is not something that I think about a lot, but if you have hundreds of people over like a month visiting a campsite and then they all have a fire, there's gonna be a lot of ash buildup. And then the more that ash builds up, the closer that fire is to the outside of the fire pit. So they occasionally need to go in and like dig out the ashes and like, you know, press the actual pit down to make sure it's secure and safe. So we have a really cool volunteer program. I started managing this program officially last October. So I've only officially been in this position for about a year. But I've been able to meet a lot of really cool people and kind of shadow on some really cool projects. And we this year had 206 individual volunteers. So that's how many folks I actually have in my database, which is pretty big. We have a lot of people who care about the park and want to give back. And I really appreciate that. And they worked so far, last year, worked 25,726 hours, which when you calculate it on like an average of California, that's worth almost 800,000 hours of labor. So volunteers are not just like important in our hearts, but like fiscally important. Volunteering really helps. So, you know, our project's timeline is essentially like this. Someone has an idea and then we execute it, and volunteers fit right in there as part of the result. So we would literally be nowhere without volunteers. So thank you. And hopefully all of you get to volunteer at Joshua Tree someday. So that was a little wordier than I thought it would be, sorry. So what questions do you guys have about the park or about our volunteer program?
So some of them are, one is, from how far afield do volunteers come from?
Great question. So we sometimes have, depending on the need of the park. So our volunteer program is needs-based, right? We have more people who are interested in volunteering. Thankfully, that's amazing. Then we do have opportunities for volunteers. So we want to make sure that we're putting people in places or in positions and on projects that are valuable, that are going to make them feel, what's the word I'm looking for? And like enthusiastic and fulfilled, and that's going to help the park. We don't want to put folks into positions where you're just sitting in a visitor center because you wanted to volunteer, even though there's not really anything to do. So it's definitely a needs-based program. So if there is a need, we have taken international volunteers. So there have been folks who are interested in coming to Joshua Tree and living here for a few months and, you know, volunteering with our vegetation branch, doing invasive plant stuff. And if they have a good resume and they look like, you know, we should take a chance on having this person fly thousands of miles to come here, and we have done that before. So people come literally from all over the United States and less often the world to volunteer at Joshua Tree. Just in case, I guess actually it doesn't apply to any of you because you all live here, and any international program would be totally different in a different country. But so we have actually an IVIP program. There's a woman who coordinates the IVIP program, which I don't remember her name. I've only chatted with her a couple times. But so all international volunteers, if they're going to be provided something by the park, like housing, they have to go through that program because they have to get a J1 visa. Because that's like a compensation if we provide them housing. So if you have any international friends who are interested in volunteering, have them check out the IVIP program because that's the first step. Yeah.
All right. The next question, do Joshua Trees provide important resources to other flora and fauna, or are they just great to look at? If not,
that's a good question.
Plant?
So I don't know if they're a keystone species. That's probably a better question to our vegetation specialist, Neil. But I do know that they are important in our ecosystem. So one of the animals that lives here is the antelope ground squirrel. And they're this cute little squirrel that looks, everyone calls it chipmunk because it does kind of look like what we think a chipmunk is. And I don't actually know the difference between a chipmunk and a ground squirrel. My guess is chipmunks live in trees. But so they have like 2 white stripes on their back, and they have a cute little fluffy tail that they put over their bodies, like fold over their bodies for like protection from the sun and the heat, and then they flap it over when they need to. But they love Joshua Tree fruits. So they will like climb up on the trees and like eat the fruits, and so they spread a lot of the seed. So antelope ground squirrels eat Joshua Tree fruits. There's also a species of lizard we have, the yucca night lizard, and they're these like really tiny little lizards. They're so cute. They all look like babies because they're like full grown, maybe the size of my pinky, and they live under dead and down Joshua trees. So that's like one of their most favorite habitats is under like the trunk of a dead Joshua tree. And then other animals like scorpions and other insects will live under dead and down Joshua trees because they actually stick around for a long time. Like they just get dried out. They don't decompose super fast because it's so dry here. And then animals like jackrabbits and cottontails will eat the leaves of the Joshua trees. And there are animals that will like nest in the like fluffy, scraggly bark of the Joshua trees, like insects and lizards. So they are really important, especially because, you know, at our park and in the Mojave, there's not a lot of big plants. So Joshua trees are one of the larger plants. So they can also act as kind of like a nurse plant for smaller seedlings if they're growing around, because they provide a tiny bit, like literally just like a little sliver of shade. So yeah, they're important because they're one of the bigger plants in an ecosystem that doesn't have a lot of big plants. Yeah.
And do you have an active interface with the local indigenous people?
I do not. So our park does, yes. That is our cultural resources branch. They have an active interface with our indigenous groups. And I would say what I perceive as a pretty healthy relationship, which I feel really lucky for. But actually, so the cultural project that I was on last week, we had a tribal monitor who was just, making sure that we were doing all the appropriate things, and anything that was found was cataloged and, put in a bag and saved. And so that was a really cool experience because I've never been on a project with a tribal monitor before. And also she was like really nice and friendly. So I enjoyed hanging out with her. But yeah, so we consult our tribes on everything we do that would affect, like their, something that relates to like their history in what is now the park. So anytime we like change a trail or change, I guess a historic structure, even though like the historic structures were modern. But yeah, anytime we make changes to a trail or putting something in the ground, which is where, those artifacts would be, or we're wanting to interpret, indigenous stories, we consult our tribes on everything. So while I don't have direct contact with them, people in the park do. So our tribes are very important to us having a successful park because they were here way before we were. So it's important for us to get their consult.
All right. And are there any attempts to acquire former Kaiser iron mine land still going on? Is there any update on that?
No, can you, whoever asked that question, can you explain a little more? Because I like maybe have heard those words before, but I don't know.
Let's see. Leave it.
I know that, so to broadly, we have a lot of mines in the park. We have like a storied mining history. And there are many not many active mines in the park. I don't know that we even have active mines in the park right now, because I know most of the mines in the park there were some successful mines, but like none of them were rich, super money-making mines. Mm-hmm. And so as far as I know, we don't have any like really active mine claims in the park, but we do have old mines. So what's the Kaiser mine?
They haven't responded, but what were the common mines in Joshua Tree?
So the Lost Horse mine is one of the most popular ones because there's a trail that goes to that. And I think Lost Horse mine was an iron mine. We had, so basically we mined a little bit of gold, silver, copper, and iron. And I think those were like the 4 big ones. So Keys Ranch, our historic site, was associated with the Desert Queen mine because before it became Keys Ranch, with the passing of Bill Keys, it used to be the Desert Queen Ranch. So the Desert Queen mine was a big like collection of mines. I should say like a compound of mines that mined mostly silver, I think. So, and then the Silver Bell mine, which I've hiked up to, was a copper mine. And that is a really pretty hike if any of you come here. It's pretty short too, it's manageable.
So they responded, they mentioned that it's the large area to the southeast surrounded by parkland was a former area which was mined for iron.
Okay, there's a lot of, so we have a couple of different things that have happened in like the southeast part of the park. Like I know recently there was talk of having a, oh my gosh, I don't remember what it was like water, they would extract water or create some sort of like energy producing structure using water, and we were worried that it would essentially like drain all the water out of like what is now the park, so that like the plants wouldn't be able to use it. A lot of our like seasonal springs would be dry, so animals wouldn't use it. So I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that there's a lot like politically going on in the southeast part of the park. So one more thing for me to look up, read up on. Yeah.
Yeah. Is off-roading allowed on the Purdue Canyon Trail?
So off-roading is not allowed anywhere, but Purdue Canyon Trail is a dirt road that you can drive on. So yes, Purdue Canyon is a road that you can, Purdue Canyon Road is a road that if you have, I would suggest a Jeep, like a crawler, because I know there's some like narrow passages there where you have to go up onto rocks to go through. So if you have those skills, yes, you are totally welcome to drive on Purdue Canyon, and it connects to Geology Tour Road, and then you can get in the main part of the park. Just make sure not to go off-road, stay on the road.
And sometimes, Carrie, we are designated to use those terms because those are what's written in our compendium.
Yes.
So even though they may sound too generous, it is for our liability as well. So it's kind of weird.
So,
it gets a little sticky.
Yeah, I've done that trail a few times. It's
cool.
It's really difficult.
I've heard, I have never done Purdue. I've only done just Geo Tour up to the loop. And whenever folks ask about it, I'm always very cautious just because, especially now, like right now, because if you get stuck out there, you likely won't have service and it's really hot.
Mm-hmm.
So I always just advise people, if you've done like really rough, terrain before, sure, and you trust yourself, great, but just know you likely won't have service. And also it's really expensive to get to it out of the park. It can be like upwards of $1,000.
Oh,
So,
yeah. And,
but that's good to know. Yeah, I've never done Purdue, but it looks pretty from the pictures I've seen.
The entrance looks very benign, off of Dillon Road there. It's like really pretty, and you head up about a mile later, you're hating life. Unless you have a really stout, high clearance vehicle, preferably 4-wheel drive. Yeah,
I've heard that high clearance is like essential for Purdue. So,
yes.
But yeah, I'm always cautious, and like Riza said, most people when they say off-roading in the park, they do mean driving on dirt roads, but we just want to make sure that we're saying the right things so that nothing can be misinterpreted and we don't cause the demise of an area of our park.
Yeah, when I hear off-road or I hear if I see off-road, trail or something, I'm thinking 4x4, I'm gonna go crazy and do some, wheelies or some spin outs. But yeah, we just gotta, it's weird how the language is, and you just gotta be aware. That's why we're always telling visitors, do your homework before you visit. Call the visitor center and do your research that way you're not in those situations.
Right, because so many people see a line on a map and they think, oh, great. The next thing they know, they're hating life because you're high centered on a boulder somewhere.
Yeah, and luckily we don't get too much of that happening at Purdue, but we do get a lot of folks in like normal sedans and compact cars stuck on our dirt roads because maybe misinterpreted the sign or didn't see it or something, but we do get a lot of folks who get stuck on the dirt roads.
Well, a helpful hint for modern cars, which are mostly these days front-wheel drive, if you need to make a one of those 3-point U-turns on a dirt road, back off of the road. Don't drive off the front because your drive wheels are now stuck in the sand.
Interesting.
If you back off and not all the way off of the road, you still have traction to get out. And I know that because I've dug vehicles out that I happen to be driving. I learned that the hard way.
Yeah, one time I used to drive a Toyota Corolla and I just wouldn't take it on dirt roads because I had gotten stuck in sand a couple times. It just really didn't like sand, it would always dig in immediately. So I just stopped.
All right, is there any other questions from anybody? Going once, going twice. All right, Sasha, thanks again for taking the time out of your workday.
Thank you for volunteering.
And we'll keep in touch, and this video will be on YouTube by Monday or Tuesday. So
cool. And if any of you are interested, in volunteering or know someone who's interested in volunteering for us, we post everything. All of our like active recruitments are on volunteer.gov and our webpage. So if there's something, you will see it.
Awesome. All right.
Okay,
Take
well,
care,
thank you
everybody.
all. Yeah.
Take care. Bye.
Bye, thank you.